We're on page 7. Here we go. Just before dawn, he rose quietly, got ready with the lights off so as not to disturb his roommates. They often snarled at him for reading in bed at night, even when he used a tiny pin light under the covers, and hurried down to the kitchen. Miss Pronomal was already waiting for him. She had been too excited to sleep as well and had arrived early. The kettle was just beginning to whistle on the stove, and Miss Pronomal was with her back to him, was setting out cups and saucers. "Good morning, Miss Pronomal," he said froggily. He cleared his throat. "I was glad to hear your mother's doing better." "Thank you, Renee." "Would you?" Miss Pronomal turned, then took one look at him and said, "You'll not make a good impression dressed like that, I'm afraid. One mustn't wear striped pants with a checkered shirt." Renee: "In fact, I believe those must belong to a roommate. They're at least 2 sizes too big. Also, it appears that one of your socks is blue and the other is purple." Renee looked down at his outfit in surprise. Usually, he was the least noticeable of the boys. He was of average size, of an average pale complexion, his brown hair was of average length, and he wore average clothes. This morning, though, he would stand out in a crowd, unless it happened to be a crowd of clowns. He grinned at Miss Pronomal and said, "I dressed this way for luck." "Luckily, you won't need luck," said Miss Pronomal, taking the kettle from the stove. "Now please go change, and this time, turn on your light. Never mind how your roommates grumble, so that you may have better luck choosing your clothes." When Renee returned, Miss Pronomal told him that she had a long errand to run. Her mother had been prescribed new medicine and a special diet, and Miss Pronomal must go shopping for her. So it was agreed that she would take him to the test and pick him up when it was over. After a light breakfast, neither of them wanted more than toast. Yet, well before anyone else in the orphanage had arisen, Miss Pronomal drove him across the sleepy city to an office building near Stonetown Bay. A line of children already stood at the door, all of them accompanied by their parents, all fidgeting nervously. When Miss Pronomal moved to get out of the car, Renee said, "I thought you were dropping me off." "You don't think I would just leave here without investigating first, do you?" replied Miss Pronomal. "The notice didn't even list a telephone number for questions. It's a bit out of the ordinary, don't you think?" So Renee took his place at the end of the line while Miss Pronomal went inside the building to speak with someone. It was a long line, and Renee wondered how many special opportunities were available. Perhaps only a few. Perhaps they would all be given out before he had even reached the door. He was growing anxious at this idea when a friendly man ahead of him turned and said, "Don't worry, son. You haven't long to wait. All the children are to go inside together in a few minutes. They made the announcement just before you arrived." Renee thanked him gratefully, noticing that as he did so, a number of parents were casting grumpy looks at the man, apparently disliking the notion of being friendly to competitors. The man, embarrassed, turned away from Renee and said nothing else. "Very well," said Miss Pronomal when she returned. "Everything is set. You may call me on their telephone when you've finished the test. Here's the number. If I'm not back by then, simply call a taxi and Mr. Rutger will pay the fare. You can tell me all about it this afternoon." "Thanks so much for everything, Miss Pronomal," said Renee, earnestly taking her hand. "Oh, Renee, you silly child, don't look so grateful," said Miss Pronomal. To Renee's surprise, there were tears on her cheeks. "It's nothing at all. Now give your poor tutor a hug. I imagine my services won't be needed after this." "I haven't passed it yet, Miss Pronomal." "Oh, stop being silly," she said, after squeezing him tightly. Miss Pronomal dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, walked determinedly to her car, and drove away just as the children were ushered into the building. It was a curious test. The first section was rather what Renee would have expected. 1 or 2 questions regarding octagons and hexagons, another devoted to bushels and kilograms of this and that, and another that required calculating how much time must pass before 2 speeding trains collided. The last question Renee answered with a thoughtful frown. Nothing in the margin that since 2 trains were approaching each other on an empty stretch of track, it was likely the engineers would recognize the impending disaster and apply their brakes, thus avoiding the collision altogether. Renee raced through these questions and many like them, then came to the second section, whose first question was, "Do you like to watch television?" This certainly was not the sort of question Renee had expected. It was only a question of preference. Anyway, of course he liked to watch television. Everybody liked to watch television. He started to mark down the answer, however. Renee hesitated. Well, did he really, though? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he didn't, in fact, like to watch television at all. I really am an oddball, he thought, with a feeling of disappointment. Nonetheless, he answered the question truthfully. No. The next question read, "Do you like to listen to the radio?" And again, Renee realized that he did not, although he was sure everyone else did. With a growing sense of isolation, he answered the question, no. The third question, thankfully, was less emotional. It read, "What is wrong with this statement?" How funny, Renee thought, and marking down his answer, he felt somewhat cheered. "It isn't a statement at all," he wrote, "it's a question." The next page showed a picture of a chessboard upon which all of the pieces and pawns rested in their starting positions except for a black pawn, which had advanced 2 spaces. The question read, "According to the rules of chess, it is this position possible?" Renee studied the board for a moment, scratched his head, and wrote down the answer, yes. After a few more pages of questions, all of which Renee felt confident he had answered correctly, he arrived at the test's final question. Are you brave? Just reading the words quickened Renee's heart. Was he brave? Bravery had never been required of him, so how could he tell? Miss Pernomal would say he was. She would point out how cheerful he tried to be despite feeling lonely, how patiently he withstood the teasing of other children, and how he was always eager for a challenge. But these things only showed that he was good-natured, polite, and often bored. Did they really show that he was brave? He didn't think so. Finally, he gave up trying to decide and simply wrote, "I hope so." He laid down his pencil and looked around. Most of the other children were also finishing the test. At the front of the room, munching rather loudly on an apple, the test administrator was keeping a close eye on them to ensure they didn't cheat. She was a thin woman in a mustard yellow shirt with a yellowish complexion, short, cropped, rusty red hair, and a stiff posture. She reminded Renee of a giant walking pencil. "Pencils?" the woman suddenly called out, as if she'd read his thoughts. The children jumped in their seats. "Please lay down your pencils now," the woman said. "The test is over." "But I'm not finished," one child cried. "That's not fair." "I want more time," cried another. The woman's eyes narrowed. "I'm sorry you haven't finished, children, but the test is over. Please pass your papers to the front of the room and remain seated while the tests are graded. Don't worry, it won't take long." As the papers were passed forward, Renee heard the boy behind him snicker and say to his neighbor, "If they couldn't finish that test, they shouldn't even have come. Like that chess question, who could have missed it?" The neighbor, sounding every bit as smug, replied, "They were trying to trick us. Pawns can only move 1 space at a time, so of course the position isn't possible. I'll bet some stupid kids didn't know that." "Ha! You're just lucky you didn't miss it yourself. Pawns can move 2 spaces. On their very first move they can. But whether it moved 1 space or 2 is beside the point. Don't you know that white always moves first? The black pawn couldn't have moved yet at all. It's so simple. This test was for babies." "Are you calling me a baby?" growled the other. "You boys there," snapped the pencil woman. "Stop talking." Renee was suddenly anxious. Could he possibly have answered that question wrong? And what about the other questions? Except for the odd ones about television and bravery, they had seemed easy, but perhaps he was such a strange bird that he misunderstood everything. He shook his head and tried not to care. If he wanted to prove himself brave, after all, he had better stop worrying. If he must return to his old routine at the orphanage, at least he had Miss Pernomal. What did it matter if he was different from other children? Everyone got teased from time to time. He was no different in that respect. René told himself this, but his anxious feeling didn't fade. After all the tests had been turned in, the pencil woman stepped out of the room, leaving the children to bite their nails and watch the clock. Only a few minutes passed, however, before she returned and announced, "I shall now read the names of children admitted into the second phase of the test." The children began to murmur. A second phase? The advertisement had mentioned a second phase. The woman continued, "If your name is called, you are to report to the Monk Building on 3rd Street no later than 1 o'clock, where you will join children from other sessions who also passed the test." She went on to lay out the rules about pencils, erasers, and disqualification. Then she popped a handful of peanuts into her mouth and chewed ferociously, as if she were starving. René raised his hand. Yes, the woman said, swallowing. "Excuse me, you say to bring only one pencil, but what if the pencil lead breaks? Will there be a pencil sharpener?" Again, the boy behind René snickered, this time muttering, "What makes him so sure he'll be taking the test? She hasn't even called the names yet." It was true, he should have waited until she'd called the names. He must have seemed very arrogant. Cheeks burning, René ducked his head. The pencil woman answered, "Yes, if a sharpener should become necessary, one will be provided. Children are not to bring their own. Understood?" There was a general nodding of heads, after which the woman clapped the peanut grit from her hands, took out a sheet of paper, and continued, "Very well. If there are no other questions, I shall read the list." The room became very quiet. "Renard Muldron," the woman called. René's heart leapt. There was a grumble of discontent from the seat behind him, but as soon as it passed, the room grew quiet again, and the children waited with bated breath for the other names to be called. The woman glanced up from the sheet. "That is all," she said matter-of-factly, folding the paper and tucking it away. "The rest of you are dismissed." As the children filed out the door, some weeping bitterly, some stunned, some whining in complaint, René approached the woman. For some reason, she was hurrying around the room, checking the window locks. "Excuse me, miss, may I use your telephone? My tutor said—" "I'm sorry, Renard," the woman interrupted, tugging unsuccessfully on a closed window. "I'm afraid there isn't a telephone." "But Miss Pernomal—" "Renard," the woman said with a smile, "I'm sure you can make do without one, can't you? Now, if you'll excuse me, I must sneak out the back door. These windows appear to have been painted shut." "Sneak out? But why?" "I have learned from experience. Any moment now, some of these children's parents will come storming in to demand explanations. Unfortunately, I have none to give. Therefore, I must go. I'll see you this afternoon. Don't be late." And with that, away she went. It had been a strange business indeed, and René had suspicion that it was about to grow stranger still. When the distant church bell struck the quarter hour, René finished his sandwich and rose from the park bench. If the doors to the Monk Building weren't open by now, he would try to find another way in. At this point, it would hardly surprise him to discover he must enter the building through a basement window. All right. As he mounted the steps to the Monk Building's broad front plaza, René saw two girls well ahead of him walking together towards the front doors. Other test takers, he guessed. One girl, who seemed to have green hair, though perhaps this was a trick of the light. The sun shone blindingly bright today, was carelessly flinging her pencil up in the air and catching it again. Not the best idea, René thought, and sure enough, even as he thought it, the girl missed the pencil and watched it fall through a grate at her feet. For a moment, the other girl hesitated, as if she might try to help. Then she checked her watch. In only a few minutes, it would become 1 o'clock. "Sorry about your pencil. It's a shame," she said, but already her sympathetic expression was fading. Clearly, it had occurred to her that with the green-haired girl unable to take the test, there would be less competition. With a spreading smile, she hurried across the plaza and through the front doors of the Monk Building, which had finally been unlocked. The metal grate covered a storm drain that ran beneath the plaza, and the unfortunate girl was staring through it down into the darkness when Renee reached her. Her appearance was striking, indeed, even startling. She had coal-black skin, hair so long she could have tied it around her waist, and yes, it truly was green, and an extraordinarily puffy white dress that gave you the impression she was standing in a cloud. "That's rotten luck," Renee said, "to drop your pencil here of all places." The girl looked up at him with hopeful eyes. "You don't happen to have an extra one, do you?" "I'm sorry. I was told to bring—" I know, she interrupted. "Only one pencil." "Well, that was my only pencil, and a fat lot of good it will do me down in that drain." She stared wistfully through the grate a moment and looked up at Renee as if surprised to see him still standing there. "What are you waiting for? The test starts any minute." All right, we'll stop right there. Whew. All right, so Renee went to the first part of the test, took it. Oh, I should stop this.